This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. If you click on the link in the description below, it'll take you to their store and they'll know I sent you there. Hello everyone, I'm Hone, and it is Wednesday, so that means it's time for another MTG Top 10, the series where I rank cards based on their historical performance at Magic's highest level of competition. Over the years, I've looked at various mana costs, and it is a goal of mine to cover them all at some point. And this time around, we're looking at one of the higher mana costs in the game, 10. Things that cost 10 mana tend to do hugely powerful things, since 10 mana is asking a lot of most decks, and this list definitely has some impressively powerful cards on it. To be eligible for this list, a card had to have a converted mana cost of 10. There were only 33 cards eligible for this list, and in this video, we'll talk about the 10 that have made the biggest impact on competitive Magic. Before we get started, a quick reminder on how I score cards in these videos. A Pro Tour, Players Tour, Mythic Championship, or Legacy or Vintage Championship is worth 2 points, and a Grand Prix or Magic Fest Top 8 is worth 1 point. Alright, let's move to number 10. At number 10, I have Sway of the Stars, which has to be one of the wackiest cards to ever appear in a top 8 Pro Tour deck. Sway sort of resets the game, but puts both players at 7 life instead of 20. It does a good job of getting you out of a bad situation, but it also doesn't actively do anything to help make sure you will succeed after the board resets, especially because your opponent will normally be taking a crack at the 7 new cards before you do, since, you just paid 10 mana. However, Olivier Rouel came up with an interesting plan for Sway of the Stars at the Kamigawa Block Pro Tour in 2005. Heartbeat of Spring was played in a lot of decks at that Pro Tour, and Olivier's deck could just use it to power out some impressive creatures rather early, like lots of decks did, but the wackiest thing it could do was amass a ton of lands and make enough mana not only to cast Sway of the Stars, but enough to allow him to play at least a few of the cards he drew. He would float the mana, cast Sway of the Stars, and then cast things that he drew. This was devastating because the opponent would of course be starting from scratch, and staring down any big creature in that situation is pretty much game over, especially at 7 life. While Sway's only Pro Tour top 8 came at that event, it was definitely one of the sweetest, jankiest decks to ever top 8 a Pro Tour, and definitely should have made my MTG top 10 on that topic. At number 9, it's Broodstar. Weirdly enough, the number 9 and number 10 on this list have a lot in common. Both are blue, both obviously have a converted mana cost of 10, both have a single Pro Tour top 8 in their respective block format, and both have star in the name. Anyway, Broodstar comes with the famously strong Affinity mechanic, so you're never actually paying 10 mana for him the way one actually would with Sway of the Stars. Thanks to the presence of lots of cheap artifacts and artifact lands, it was easy to power out a Broodstar in turn 3 or 4 who was absolutely massive. The artifact lands ultimately got banned out of block, but Broodstar may never have really taken off anyway. Later artifact-based decks built around the powerful cards of Mirrodin block never really went with Broodstar because there were more powerful options around. At number 8, it is Kozilek, Butcher of Truth. Anytime one talks about hugely powerful cards at high mana costs, Eldrazi immediately come to mind, so it shouldn't be a surprise to see one here. Kozilek comes with the powerful Annihilator mechanic, which basically means that as soon as it attacks, the game is over for your opponent because they start losing permanents. Additionally, if you cast him, you also get to draw 4 cards, so good luck winning after someone casts one of these against you. Kozilek was played in standard Eldrazi green decks, which sought to use Eye of Ugin and Eldrazi Temple to power out huge Eldrazi early, like the Butcher. He also has a Grand Prix top 8 coming from an appearance in a Tron deck in Modern. Eldrazi ramp decks are a thing these days in Modern, but Kozilek usually isn't one of the ones who gets played, but I don't think it would shock anyone to see Kozilek at a top 8 at an event in the future either. At number 7, it is Myojin of Seeing Winds. If you cast this thing for 10 mana, it comes into play with a divinity counter, which makes it indestructible, but the real power comes from removing that counter, which draws you a card for every single permanent you control. The Myojin doesn't deliver that power if you cheat it into play or reanimate it, and that has prevented it from being a big deal in formats other than block, where it was played, like Sway of the Stars, in Heartbeat of Springs decks, which could actually produce the necessary 10 mana for the Myojin, and then draw all of those cards. At number 6, it is Gingatoxeus, Core Augur. Talk about paying you off for the 10 mana you spend. In this case, Gingatoxeus draws you 7 cards on your instep, while also making it so your opponent can't have cards in their hand at the end of their turn, or they have to discard them. Jin comes with Flash too, which means you can really punish your opponent for all the cards they have in their hand. Generally, people don't actually cast Gingatoxeus though, instead they reanimate him. All 5 of his points come from Legacy Reanimator decks, which can, absurdly enough, get Gingatoxeus into play on turn 1 or 2 using cards like Reanimate and Exhume. Obviously, if he comes down that early, it's going to be tough for an opponent to win, even if they have an answer, since you'll be drawing 7 in most cases, and if they can't deal with him on their turn, they're going to lose their whole hand, at which point the game is basically over. While Reanimator decks are still very relevant in Legacy, they don't really play Gingatoxeus anymore, instead favoring something like Gristlebrand, which draws you cards no matter what, and represents more of a threat in most ways. Because of that, Gingatoxeus doesn't have any points since 2015. At number 5, it is Progenesis. One of the most powerful creatures in the entire game, at least in a vacuum, Progenesis is almost impossible to deal with if it ever comes into play because it has protection from everything. It can only be dealt with by board sweepers that don't do damage or edict effects. Obviously, it is an incredibly difficult mana cost, but the decks it appeared in over the years get around that by cheating it into play. There weren't good ways to do that in either Standard or Block, and as a result, Progenesis was never played in either format. In Extended, though, he was used in a Hypergenesis deck, a deck that would ultimately have to get banned out of existence. Legacy is where Progenesis has picked up 12 of its 17 points. In that format, it's been cheated into play using cards like Natural Order, Sneak Attack, and Show and Tell. At number 4, it is Greater Garga Don. A 10-mana 9/7 is not something you want to be playing, but Greater Garga Don comes with a suspend mechanic, which can result in you only paying a single red mana for a huge creature. Now, it has Suspend 10, so you're going to be waiting for a while, except for the fact that you can sacrifice artifacts, creatures, or lands, usually the most plentiful permanent types, and if you do sacrifice them, you reduce the number of time counters on the Garga Don, so it comes down a lot sooner than 10 turns later. The Garga Don was played in Time Spiral Block Constructed as a sideboard card for red aggro decks. It could be brought in against players playing board sweepers, since the Garga Don would be immune to them while suspended, and because you could sacrifice all your stuff to accelerate that clock in response to a board sweeper. He was also played in Revelark decks in Standard, which were loaded up with creatures who had Evoke, like Muldrifter. Because the creatures technically enter the battlefield, even when evoked, you could cash them in by sacrificing them to the Garga Don. If you did that, you weren't really paying anything to reduce the Garga Don's time counters, because the creature is going to be sacrificed anyway, because of how Evoke works. The deck also had no problem getting creatures back with Revelark, which could provide more fodder for the Garga Don, in addition to getting useful into the battlefield triggers all over again. More recently, the Garga Don has been played in modern graveyard decks that featured Bridge from Below, and creatures like Vengevine, Gravecrawler, and Bloodghast. These creatures constantly come back, so they provide nice fodder for the Garga Don. When they die, you also get a 2/2 zombie, which can also be sacrificed to the Garga Don, and so forth. The Garga Don was also nice in the mirror, because it could allow you to immediately deal with the bridge in most cases by sacrificing a creature to it. Bridge from Below was eventually banned in Modern, and the Garga Don hasn't been played there since then. It's also had some success in Legacy, though, where it's featured in similar graveyard decks. At number 3, it is Omniscience. It definitely gives you your mana's worth, since once it's in play, you never have to pay for a spell ever again. Provided you have card draw spells, this means you can rip through your whole deck and cast everything. But actually getting it into play isn't easy, and as a result, it has only been played in Eternal formats, where players tend to, like a lot of cards on this list, cheat it into play. In both Legacy and Vintage, this is primarily accomplished with Show and Tell, which might have a symmetrical effect, but your opponent generally isn't going to be able to slam something stronger than Omniscience onto the table. This type of Show and Tell deck is called Omni-Tell, and it's been pretty successful over the last few years, so it is likely to add to its score. At number 2, it is Commit to Memory. Some people will say that this being on the list is a cop-out, because you don't pay 10 mana for it up front, but the fact is that it has a converted mana cost of 10, and if you cast both halves over the course of a game, you are spending 10 mana, so I think it belongs here. Because this split card has Aftermath, you can only cast the memory half from the graveyard, and you can only cast the commit half from your hand. The commit half is the biggest draw of the card, as it gives you the ability to tuck spells or non-land permanents 2 cards deep in your opponent's library, and that's a pretty nice and flexible effect at instant speed. Memory is no joke either, though, as you can use it later on in the game in a situation where you've fallen really behind your opponent on cards. If you do that, you will find that you and your opponent are back on even footing in terms of cards. It can also mess with graveyard stuff your opponent is trying to do. This saw a lot of play in standard control decks during its time in the format. It was a meta with plenty of graveyard action, so even the memory half was well positioned in the format. It hasn't been played outside of standard yet, but I think it has a shot at finding some points in Pioneer. And at number 1, it is Luma Mog, the Ceaseless Hunger. An Eldrazi from Battle for Zendikar, Luma Mog may not have Annihilator, but he still comes with all kinds of crazy text. For one thing, when you cast him, you exile 2 of your opponent's permanents. This means, even if he gets countered or killed when he comes into play, you're going to be exiling 2 permanents and getting a 3-for-1. He's also indestructible, considerably narrowing the number of things that can actually kill him. And because he's so hungry, every time he attacks, you exile the top 20 cards of your opponent's library. So unlike a lot of big creatures with no evasion, you can't just chump block Ulamog forever, because your deck will quickly get milled. In Standard, Ulamog was played in Mono Green Ramp and Gruul Ramp, where decks actually sought to cast him the old-fashioned way. After all, you don't get that trigger if you cheat him into play somehow. That is, of course, until Wizards printed Aetherworks Marvel, which let you not only quickly get a huge creature like Ulamog into play, you technically cast it too. So you get to exile 2 things even if you use this method. And that method was highly effective, so much so that Aetherworks Marvel got banned in Standard because turn 4 Ulamogs were a little too much for the format. Ulamog has also been played a lot in Modern Tron and Eldrazi Tron decks, which also seek to cast him the old-fashioned way, but by using lands that produce a ton of mana. Ulamog is a firm hold on the number 1 spot on this list, and that doesn't look like it will change anytime soon. Well, that does it for this MTG Top 10. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future MTG Top 10s, don't forget to subscribe. And if you need something to binge watch, I've done almost 300 of these, and you should see the playlist now. Thanks for watching.